another class of literary theory. So, I hope you all have got the textbooks on literary theory. Anyway, I think after the autumn vacation, we can go along with the line of the textbook, because by that time you all must have grabbed a copy of the textbook. Now, since I was dealing with the history of English education and the hierarchy of how the criticism evolved, I thought I'll continue with that particular section because I had provided that link. So I'll complete that section and move over to the textbook. Meanwhile, we'll complete this portion, and after the vacation starts, we will deal with the textbook in a regular manner. Okay, by that time you all must have got a copy of the textbook. Okay, now continuing where I stopped, because we have to complete and we have to move on with the completion. So we were talking about romantics and literary theory. After romantics, we are moving on to the Victorians. After romantics came the work of Victorians like George Eliot, Matthew Arnold and Henry James. So Victorians were George Eliot, Matthew Arnold and Henry James. So there were two tracks in literary criticism at this time. There were two tracks, or two different sections, or two classifications. Track 1 was that's based on practical criticism. Now, what is this practical criticism? Practical criticism was text based. It meant the close scrutiny of the text. Scrutiny means examine or observe critically. That is scrutiny. So text based, and it followed the close scrutiny of the text. And this practical criticism, which was text based and which was track 1, was led and followed by writers like Samuel Johnson, Matthew Arnold, T.S. Eliot and F.R. Lewis. So writers of practical criticism were Samuel Johnson, Matthew Arnold, T.S. Eliot and F.R. Lewis. And the next one, track 2. Track 2 was idea based on ideas, and the preoccupations of track 2 were similar to what the critical theorists of the years 1960s believed. So the second one, that is track 2, was idea based, not text based, purely idea based, and it was similar to what the critical theorists of 1960s followed and believed. The writers of track 2 were Sidney, Wordsworth, Coleridge, George Eliot and Henry James. So writers of track 2 again, Sidney, Wordsworth, Coleridge, George Eliot and Henry James. The concept of close reading emerged from the works of Matthew Arnold, and this was adopted by F.R. Lewis. So initially, close reading emerged from the works of Matthew Arnold, later adapted by F.R. Lewis. And Arnold suggested that literature was a substitute for religion. So at this time, there were the conflict of science and religion. A book of Charles Darwin, Origin of Species, was released. So it was at this time that the conflict between science and religion existed. So that should keep in mind, that history. And because of that, Matthew Arnold suggested that literature was a substitute for religion. Why do you need religion? To strengthen your mind, something which you can rely upon. So he felt that literature is something you can depend upon, to rely upon, to have a solace for your mind. So Arnold always suggested that literature was a substitute for religion. Significant works of Matthew Arnold: The Function of Criticism at the Present Time and The Study of Poetry. So two works of Matthew Arnold are The Function of Criticism at the Present Time and The Study of Poetry. Keep in mind, it's important. And he called for the disinterestedness of literature. He felt that literature should be there, but it should have a certain kind of disinterestedness. Interest illadica, that is disinterestedness. And it should not have any political commitment, which means that literature is something to appreciate, but you should not connect each and everything with literature. There should be some kind of detachment with literature, and it should not have any political commitment. It should not be politically oriented. It should come from within. It should come from within your mind. It should not have relation or connection with something outside, something extrinsic, something external. Matthew Arnold put forward the Touchstone Method. We should know what this Touchstone Method is. Touchstone Method is a method to assess the contemporary literary works by using aspects of the literary works of the past as touchstone. So, it is a method to assess contemporary literary works. Contemporary, current literary works assess judge method. How? By using the literary works of the past. പണ്ടത്തെ മഹാന്മാരായിട്ടുള്ള എഴുത്തുകാരെ എഴുതി വെച്ചിട്ടുള്ള ലിറ്റററി വർക്ക്സിനെ ബേസ് ചെയ്തിട്ട് ഇപ്പോഴത്തെ കറന്റ് ആയിട്ട് എഴുതുന്ന റൈറ്റേഴ്സിന്റെ വർക്ക്സ് അസസ് ചെയ്യാം, ജഡ്ജ് ചെയ്യാം. ദാറ്റ് ഈസ് ഹൗ യു ഗിവ് ദം എ സർട്ടിഫിക്കറ്റ്. നമ്മൾ പറയില്ലേ ഇത് നല്ലതാണ്, ഇത് മോശമാണ്, ഇറ്റ് ഹാസ് ദിസ് ഈസ് എ ക്ലാസിക്, ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് എ ഗുഡ് വർക്ക് എന്നൊക്കെ പറയില്ലേ. അങ്ങനെ ഇവാലുവേറ്റ് ചെയ്യാനുള്ള ഒരു മെത്തേഡാണ് ടച്ച്സ്റ്റോൺ മെത്തേഡ്. ആൻഡ് ഇറ്റ് റെഫേഴ്സ് ടു ടച്ച്സ്റ്റോൺ മെത്തേഡ് ഓഫ് ഗോൾഡ്. നമ്മൾ ഗോൾഡ് ഒക്കെ ടെസ്റ്റ് ചെയ്യില്ലേ, ഒരു ഉരകല്ല് വെച്ചിട്ട് ഗോൾഡ് ടെസ്റ്റ് ചെയ്യും. ടച്ച്സ്റ്റോൺ ഈസ് സ്റ്റോൺ ഫോർ ടെസ്റ്റിംഗ് അലോയ്സ് ഓഫ് ഗോൾഡ്. ഗോൾഡ് ഒക്കെ ടെസ്റ്റ് ചെയ്യാൻ നല്ലതാണോ, ഇസ് ഇറ്റ് പ്യോർ ഇനഫ്, അതറിയാൻ വേണ്ടിയിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു സ്റ്റോണില്ലേ. ഫ്രം ദാറ്റ് കംസ് ദിസ് വേർഡ് touchstone. So it is a criteria or a standard or a scale to assess the works of contemporary writers, and this is much more of a scientific method. ഇതൊരു criticism or evaluation അല്ല. It goes more or relies more to the scientific objectivity. കുറച്ചുകൂടി scientific method ആണിത്. Okay. It is a yardstick or a criteria. So to assess the works of contemporary writers, you go back to the past and compare it with the standard of the literary works of the past. Okay, that is touchstone method. Method to assess contemporary literary works by using aspects of literary works of the past as touchstone. The major names in literary theory in Britain in the 20th century were T.S. Eliot, William Emerson, I.A. Richards and F.R. Lewis. So, in Britain, in the 20th century, the prominent names or prominent literary theorists were T.S. Eliot, William Emerson, I.A. Richards and F.R. Lewis. All of them except T.S. Eliot belonged to the Cambridge school. We have already seen this, that is William Emerson, I.A. Richards and F.R. Lewis belong to the Cambridge school, and T.S. Eliot was the exception here. They were engineers to a new approach to English studies. That is the Cambridge scholars, William Emerson, I.A. Richards and F.R. Lewis were engineers to a new approach to English studies. Eliot's major critical ideas were dissociation of sensibility, poetic impersonality, objective correlative. We will see this one by one. His critical ideas, which is dissociation of sensibility, poetic impersonality and objective correlative. Let's see what dissociation of sensibility is. Dissociation of sensibility is a literary term first used by T.S. Eliot in his essay The Metaphysical Poets. So, dissociation of sensibility is a literary term which T.S. Eliot used in his essay The Metaphysical Poets. So, before seeing what dissociation of sensibility is, I would like to tell you what metaphysical poetry is. Metaphysical poetry is a highly intellectualized and poetry, and it has complicated thoughts too. So, usually poetry is not known to be highly intellectualized. It has no any scientific background or scientific data in it. it comes from your heart. It does not come from your head. See, there are thoughts which come from your head and which comes out from your heart. So you can always connect the thoughts from your head as thoughts and feelings from your heart. Okay, so always relate head to thoughts and feelings to heart. You take decisions at times. Sometimes you think intellectually and take decisions. Sometimes you take decisions from your heart, what your mind says, what your heart says. So similarly, poetry is usually written from your thoughts or emotions or feelings. But metaphysical poetry is written through complicated thoughts. It was a highly intellectualized kind of poetry. So Eliot describes the term dissociation of sensibility in his essay, The Metaphysical Poets. Metaphysical poetry belonged to the 17th century, early 16th century and 17th century. Now we have to know what this dissociation of sensibility is. It refers to the way in which intellectual thought was separated from the experience of feeling in the 17th century poetry. So it is the way in which intellectual thought was separated from the experience of feeling, that is from your heart, in the 17th century poetry. So what you have to know is that thought and feeling was separated. Thought from your head, feeling from your heart was separated. Eliot used the term to describe the manner in which the nature and substance of English poetry changed between the time of Donne and Lord Herbert, that is George Herbert, who belonged to the 17th century metaphysical poetry, and the time of Tennyson and Browning. Those were Victorian poets. Okay, so he uses term to describe the manner in which poetry differed, the nature and substance of poetry differed between these two, time era, that is 17th century and late 17th century. This is early 16th and 17th century. This is late 17th century. Here, the poets who belong to 17th century metaphysical poetry were John Donne, George Herbert, again Milton Dryden was also there. Here they expressed thought through feeling. That is, they combined the intellectual with feeling. Thought were combined through feeling. Thought were expressed through feeling. That is, thoughts from the head and thoughts from the heart were combined. But here in the late 17th century, Tennyson and Browning, they belong to the Victorian era. They did not unite thought and feeling. They felt that intellectual ideas did not have anything to do with feelings or emotions. They completely divided thought and feeling. They did not unite thought and feeling. Okay, so that difference, the nature and substance of poetry, is expressed by Eliot in his essay, The Metaphysical Poets. And in this essay, he describes the term dissociation of sensibility. So here what I would like to tell you is that the poets of 17th century, that is successors of 16th century, possessed a mechanism of sensibility. It was at this time, that is, it was at the time of 17th century, dissociation of sensibility set in. This dissociation was advanced by two powerful poets of the century, Milton and Dryden. So it was advanced by Milton and Dryden. This dissociation of sensibility was advanced by Milton and Dryden. And in metaphysical poetry, you have to know that the thoughts were expressed through feeling. In metaphysical poetry, thoughts were expressed through feeling, and the later poets, that is after the 17th century, after the era of metaphysical poetry, those poets, later poets, did not unite thoughts through feeling. They expressed thoughts separately from feeling. Moving on to impersonality or impersonal theory. This theory was explained by Eliot in his essay tradition and individual talent. The central point of this theory, that is impersonality theory or impersonal theory, which was put forward by Eliot in his essay Tradition and Individual Talent, is the poet, the man, and the poet, the artist, are two different entities. Poet as a man, as a human being, and poet as the artist, the writer, are two different entities, are completely two different systems, or they exist separately. They are not one and the same. He says that poetry is not an expression of personality, but an escape from personality. He feels that it is not poetry, a poetic composition, or a poetic work, or work of literature. It is not an expression of the poet's personality, but it is an escape. He moves from his personality. It is an escape from his personality, or he moves from his personality. He moves away from his personality. In simple words, it means that personal experiences are not to be associated with poetic composition. The personal experiences of a writer or a poet are not to be associated, with the poetic composition, the work of literature. You have to see it, you have to view it as two different entities. So here the central point of impersonality or impersonal theory is that poet the man and poet the artist are two different entities. The third critical idea of T.S. Eliot was objective correlative. This term, objective correlative, he put forward in his influential essay on Hamlet in 1919, that is Hamlet and His Problems. This term, objective correlative, was first introduced by American painter Washington Allston in 1840, but it was popularized by T.S. Eliot in his influential essay on Hamlet in 1990, that is Hamlet and His Problems. So, introduced by American painter Washington Allston in 1840, popularized by Eliot in his essay Hamlet and His Problems, 1990. What do you mean by objective correlative? Objective correlative simply means that if writers want to create an emotional response in their audience, they simply have to use a pattern of images or actions to evoke that particular response, that appropriate emotion. Okay, so it means that if you want to evoke a particular emotion in an audience, okay, suppose നമുക്ക് ഓഡിയൻസ് കാണുന്ന ഓഡിയൻസ് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ വായിക്കുന്ന ഓഡിയൻസിൽ ഫിയർ ജനിപ്പിക്കാമെന്ന് വിചാരിക്കും, പേടി, ഹൊറർ ജനിപ്പിക്കാമെന്ന് വിചാരിക്കും. സോ യു വിൽ യൂസ് സർട്ടൻ കൈൻഡ് ഓഫ് ഡാർക്ക് ഇമേജസ്, ഒരു ഡാർക്ക് ടിൻറ്റ് കൊടുക്കും, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഒരു പെസിമിസ്റ്റിക്, ഒരു നെഗറ്റീവ് ടച്ച് കൊടുക്കും. സോ ദ റൂൾ ഗോസ് ദാറ്റ് ഇഫ് യു വോണ്ട് ടു evoke a particular emotion in an audience, a reader or a spectator, whatever the audience is, ഒരു പാറ്റേൺ ഓഫ് ഇമേജസ് ഓർ ആക്ഷൻസ് കൊടുത്തിരിക്കണം. എന്നാലാണ് അവർക്ക് ആ ഇമോഷൻ വരുള്ളൂ. അവരുടെ മനസ്സിൽ ഇമോഷൻ ജനിപ്പിക്കാൻ വേണ്ടി ഒരു പെർട്ടിക്കുലർ പാറ്റേൺ നമ്മൾ ഫോളോ ചെയ്യണം എന്നാണ് പറയുന്നത്. സി, ഇഫ് യു വാണ്ട് ടു ക്രിയേറ്റ് an emotional response in the audience, if writers want to create an emotional response in an audience, they must find a pattern of image or action to evoke that particular emotion. ഒരു particular emotion വരാൻ വേണ്ടി ഇന്ന പാറ്റേൺ നമ്മൾ ഫോളോ ചെയ്യണം. For example, if you give a dark tint or dark image, ഒരു ലൈറ്റ് ഒന്നും ഇല്ലാത്ത ഭയങ്കര ഡിം ആയിട്ടുള്ളൊരു ഇമേജറി കൊടുക്കുകയാണ് ഒരു മൂവിയിലോ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഒരു നോവലിലോ, സോ ഇറ്റ് മീൻസ് ദാറ്റ് there is some kind of horror or it creates fear in the audience. That is how it goes. That is, you should follow a certain pattern for that. In Britain, prior to the theory movement, was F.R. Lewis. So F.R. Lewis was a prominent literary critic, a very prominent and important literary critic in Britain prior to the theory movement. Theory movement ഭയങ്കര സ്ട്രോങ് ആയിട്ട് എസ്റ്റാബ്ലിഷ് ആവുന്നതിന് മുമ്പുള്ള ലിറ്റററി ക്രിട്ടിക് ആയിരുന്നു F.R. Lewis. Like Matthew Arnold, Lewis also believed in the higher function of literature because of a vacuum created by the demise of religion. So he believed that F.R. Lewis, like Matthew Arnold, believed that literature had a higher function. He believed in the higher function of literature because there was a demise of religion at that time. Religion was dying down because of the influence of science. There was a conflict between science and religion, I told you. So, since religion was dying down, demise of religion, he believed that literature had a higher function. Lewis concentrated on finding a rational method to study literature, just like Arnold's Touchstone. So Lewis believed in rational method, a logical method, a more scientific method, like Arnold's Touchstone. I told you Arnold's Touchstone has had a scientific objectivity. It did not have a critical evaluation of literature. It had a scientific objectivity based on how a literature is being assessed, how it is being valued. Okay. Like Arnold, Lewis did not politicize literature and criticism. Arnold did not politicize literature and criticism, that he believed that there was no political commitment to literature. Similarly, Lewis also did not politicize literature and criticism. The Touchstone method takes for granted the greatness of the past writers, whereas Lewis asserted that certain works were not up to the standards. When put to test under the close scrutiny method, he advocated. Lewis was greatly influenced by T.S. Eliot's thoughts. So Lewis was greatly influenced by the thoughts of T.S. Eliot, and he believed that when you use this Touchstone method, some of the writers of the past did not write very much good works. They did not write works which were all up to the mark, or which were all up to the standard, or everything did not meet that yardstick. So he felt that somewhere something was wrong with the Touchstone method, because when each work of literature was put to close scrutiny, that is close reading, close scrutiny, he felt that maybe the works of the past writers were not good enough. You should not take for granted the works of the past. Some were good though, but every works were not good. Richards and William Emerson. Emerson was a pupil of I.A. Richards, which means that I.A. Richards was a teacher and Emerson was his pupil. Emerson's 7 types of ambiguity called for ultra-close scrutiny of the text. We have already seen his work, that is William Emerson's work, that is 7 types of ambiguity. I told you what ambiguous sentences are, which create a doubt in the reader. So this work called for ultra-close scrutiny of the text, which means that there was a close reading of the text. This evokes track 1 tradition of British criticism. We saw that there were 2 tracks of British criticism, track 1 which was text based and track 2 which was idea based. So this work, 7 types of ambiguity by William Emerson, evokes track 1 edition of British criticism, which focuses on the text itself. Track 2 dealt with the major issues in literature. We saw that track 2 dealt with major issues in literature. It was idea based. Richards is remembered for his work Practical Criticism. He is famously known for his work Practical Criticism. I. Richards. In 1920s, he made certain experiments, and we have to know more about the experiments he made in 1920s. The experiment goes like this. He gave his students unannotated and anonymous poems to analyze. The aim of this experiment was to reduce the influence of received opinion. The aim of this experiment was to reduce the influence of received opinion and to establish true judgment. This text-led track was firmly established for a long time to go. See, I'll explain. His students were given unannotated and anonymous poems to analyze. His students were given certain poems to analyze or to judge or to make a critical evaluation. And what kind of poems were given to them? Unannotated. നിങ്ങൾക്ക് എക്സാംസിലൊക്കെ annotation എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞിട്ട് കാണും. ഒരു പോയമിന്റെ വരികൾ എക്സ്ട്രാക്ട് തന്നിട്ട് annotate ചെയ്യാൻ പറയും. Annotation നമ്മൾ പറയും. What do you mean by that? You have to mention who the writer is and from which poem this particular extract or which that particular section is taken. These lines are taken from. You have to mention the poem and also the poet. So here, without mentioning the poem and the poet, his students were given certain text, കുറച്ച് വരികൾ, കുറച്ച് lines കൊടുത്തിരുന്നു, unannotated. പിന്നെ anonymous poems. Anonymous എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ നമുക്കറിയാം, poet is not mentioned. നമുക്ക് poet ആയെന്ന് അറിയില്ല. അപ്പോൾ poetനെയും poem ഏതാന്ന് മെൻഷൻ ചെയ്യാതെ കുറച്ച് ലൈൻസ്, പോയത്തിന്റെ ലൈൻസ് കുട്ടികൾക്ക് കൊടുത്തു. Why? Because ഒരു particular poet ആണ് എഴുതിയെന്ന് വിചാരിക്കും. And if that poet is famous, you will tend to believe that there's some substance in it. അല്ലേ? Suppose it's a very famous, popular, ഭയങ്കര സ്കോളർലി ആയിട്ടുള്ള പോയിറ്റ് ആണ് ഒരു കവിത എഴുതിയത്. And you are asked to critically evaluate. ഒരു ഇവാലുവേഷൻ നടത്തണം എന്ന് വെച്ച് കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ നമ്മൾ വിചാരിക്കും ഇതിൽ എന്തൊക്കെയോ സബ്സ്റ്റൻസ് ഉണ്ട്, സോ മച്ച് ദാറ്റ് യു ഹാവ് ടു അസസ്, കുറെ മനസ്സിലാക്കാനുണ്ടെന്ന് നമ്മൾ വിചാരിച്ച് അത് അസസ് ചെയ്യും. പക്ഷെ if you don't know the poet and the poem, you will make your own critical evaluation and it will be true to your heart, isn't it? So why was this experiment done? To reduce the influence of received opinion. This is what I told you, received opinion. അതായത് ഒരു പെർട്ടിക്കുലർ റൈറ്റർ ആണല്ലോ, ഒരു ഗംഭീരമായിട്ടുള്ള റൈറ്റർ ആണ്, അപ്പൊ ഇവര് ഇന്നതൊക്കെ എഴുതിയിട്ടുണ്ടാവും, നമുക്ക് ഒരു പ്രയർ അസസ്മെന്റ് ഉണ്ടാവും, ഒരു അസംഷൻ ഉണ്ടാവും. ആ റിസീവ്ഡ് ഒപ്പീനിയൻ ഉണ്ടാവാതിരിക്കാനും പിന്നെ to establish true judgment. Whatever evaluation, whatever judgment you're doing, it should be true. It should be true to your heart. And this text-led track was firmly established for a long time to go. കുറേ നാള് ഈ മെത്തേഡ് ഫോളോ ചെയ്തു. Since this time, conflict between liberal humanism and theory has been a fundamental one. So all these years, there was a conflict between liberal humanism and theory. René Wellick and other critics asked Lewis to explain his ideas. നമ്മൾ ഇത് മുമ്പ് കണ്ടതാണ്. René Wellick explained Lewis to explain more about his principles, and he refused to do so. He was given a chance, but he was refused to do so. His refusal to do so was viewed as a setback. Setback? It was viewed as something, ഒരു setback ആയിപ്പോയി, അതായത് ഒരു നെഗറ്റീവ് ഇഫക്റ്റ് ആയിപ്പോയി. The belief goes that once this is done, once what is done, അതായത് once Lewis explains his principles, once Lewis explains his principles and he goes more about his kind of criticism, what will happen? Shortcomings of liberal humanism would have become obvious. അതായത് ലിബറൽ ഹ്യൂമനിസത്തിന് ഇങ്ങനെ നെഗറ്റീവ് പോയിന്റ്സ് ഉണ്ട്, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ലിമിറ്റേഷൻസ് ഉണ്ട്, ഷോർട്ട് കമ്മിങ്സ് ഉണ്ടെന്ന് കൂടുതൽ മനസ്സിലാവും. And other approaches would have a chance to replace it. And this would be replaced by other approaches. Liberal humanism would be replaced by other approaches. So René Wellick gave Lewis a chance to explain his principles. Lewis did not do that. Why Lewis did not do it? Lewis believed that liberal humanism shortcomings appo koodal obvious aavum, korchukoodi clear aavum. അപ്പോൾ ലിബറൽ ഹ്യൂമനിസത്തിന് മറ്റുള്ള അപ്രോച്ചസ്, മറ്റുള്ള ലിറ്റററി തിയറി ഡോമിനേറ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്ന വിചാരിച്ചിട്ടാവണം ലീവ്സ് ഇതിനെ പറ്റി കൂടുതൽ എക്സ്പ്ലെയിൻ ചെയ്യാതിരുന്നത്. സോ വി കം ടു ദി എൻഡ് ഓഫ് ദ പോർഷൻ ദാറ്റ് ഐ ഹാവ് ഓൾറെഡി ടേക്കൺ. ഇൻ നെക്സ്റ്റ് ക്ലാസ് we'll start with the text. Thank you and have a nice day.